People who have heard deathbed confessions, what were some interesting ones? My dad had Alzheimer's and ended up in a secure ward. He was blind and almost deaf. I was visiting him one day. He didn't know who I was, but he started talking about me. He said I had done better than him in life and that he was proud of me. He was a quiet man IRL and never told me that when I was growing up. Looking back, he did things that my dumb ass never realized were for me. Like, when he retired, his colleagues asked what he'd like as a present. He chose a scientific calculator. This was back in the 1970s. He had no use for it. He gave it to me for university. I thought he was just passing it on, not realizing that he'd asked for it with me in mind. Not my story, but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional and physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing rather than combating their imminent death. One of her patients was a bedbound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive but had flashes of recognition and engagement. It's hard to gauge the level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so they encourage family members to keep their company in hopes of soothing the patient. Now, this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations. During her hospice care, however, her great-granddaughter was the first in their family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university, in fact. Her family was supportive of her decision but often joked about her being the rebel, or Judas, or what have you. One day, they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decision. Suddenly, the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said "traitor," and fucking died. The hospice worker said her family, eventually, thought it was hilarious. My grandfather had pretty terrible dementia and he kept making deathbed confessions as he knew he didn't have much time left. They were often about witnessing a murder and not telling anyone, but each time he confessed to us the details changed. It happened a couple of times a day over the course of his final week. We finally figured out that he would watch the local news and hear about these things happening, then would think he had actually witnessed them. We had a similar situation in our extended family. Alzheimer's made this family member insanely paranoid. He thought that people were constantly trying to break into his home and murder him. Turns out his wife was watching lots of crime shows around him, and he could no longer distinguish reality from fiction. I didn't see it, but my aunt watched her elderly mother fall down the stairs and confessed just before she died that she wasn't her biological mother. She told my aunt that her oldest sister was actually her mother. The sister had gotten pregnant too young and the mom said it was hers. A common way of handling it back then. She revealed it in her very last breath. "I'm not your real mother. You came to us in a spaceship as a baby. The secret to activating your superpowers is, dies." My grandfather admitted to me and only me that he, accidentally, had sex with a man. I worked at a hospital in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town near Munich, for the last 14 years. My job there is not fancy at all. I move people around, throw the trash out, and occasionally I take care of some handy-like work, fix a leaking shower head and stuff like that. As you can imagine, I get to see a lot of patients that come and go. Some of them pass away. Such is life, I guess. I remember a few instances of people confessing to me their biggest regrets. Here are some examples. 1. An old Polish woman told me that she regretted not fucking Hitler when she had the chance. Her words. I wanted to ask her about more context, but I was afraid to be honest. 2. Another notable example was an old truck driver that used to work for an East Germany company. He told me that he once run over some kids with his truck and was too afraid to stop and check if they were okay. 3. Once another Polish lady told me that she used to be a prostitute during Second World War and that she slept with very high up people in the government. She told me that she did not regret that part of her life, but that she could not tell anyone, and that was a heavy emotional drag. She also told me that she aborted more than 5 babies during that time. Not a deathbed confession, but the last conversation I had with my grandfather has always stuck with me. He had Parkinson's and lived on a farm outside of town. One day he looked at me and said, "I'm getting too old to take care of Mom, my grandmother. I need you to do that for me, okay?" His health deteriorated pretty rapidly from that point onward. I still call my grandmother every single day, and try to get back home whenever I can to help out around the farm. I don't know if this counts as a confession, but it felt like one. My grandparents have 3 daughters. Everyone always said that my mom was my grandfather's secret favorite. He never agreed. I heard he was on his deathbed on April 6th. Went to see him on April 8th. He was scary looking and the doctor kept saying he didn't understand why he wasn't dead yet. April 9th, everyone but my mom had the chance to come and say goodbye. She doesn't drive and my dad works 10 hours away. My grandpa kept saying her name, saying. He couldn't eat or drink, so it was more like a whisper. My mom came by on the 10th. He looked at her, smiled, whispered, "My Amy." He closed his eyes and never opened them again. Not really a confession, but my cousin and I got into a car accident, and he died. His friends got him to steal and vandalize so many things. They also put him in jail 4 different times. When we were in the hospital and he was about to die, his last words were, "Well, if I go to hell, at least I'll be with all my friends. I love you." I have an amazing one. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she had collected owls. Literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them, we just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the doc said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her, and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out, she didn't really give a shit about owls. Near as we could piece together, sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember. But from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a potholder or placemat. And all of a sudden her kitchen was owl-themed. From there, it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early. Mother ran a nursing home growing up. From ages 5 to 10 I spent every weekend with residents. Because I was a kid, residents often confessed stuff they thought I wouldn't understand. Women was dying, maybe about 96. Even had her last burst of energy life where she thought she was better. This is common. A black delivery man came with some flowers. After he left, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't believe I'm dying without having been with a colored man." Second one was while I was reading Bible verses to a resident. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to drop that baby in the well." My great-aunt passed away a couple of years ago. She was suffering from viral encephalitis and fluctuated in and out of consciousness. It was truly painful to watch. Although a lot of family tended to be around her in those last days, I once happened to be alone with her when she made some fairly odd remarks, which I kept to myself since. On the day in question, I was playing games on my phone in her hospital room when she started to audibly mutter to herself. It became more urgent and intense. Eventually she explicitly called me to her side. Her eyes looked huge and confused. I doubt she knew who I was. She spat out her words, most of which were barely comprehensible, putting particular emphasis on boy and ingredient. I sat there for 15 minutes, listening to her erratic account of, as I finally gathered, how she sometimes used to cook eggs in the urine of a stable boy instead of water. She insisted that he was handsomely compensated for his services, but now and then she started to cry and couldn't stop. I googled this weeks later, and there indeed exists a traditional dish in China described in the West as virgin boy egg. Apparently this concept had fascinated her, and she frequently recreated this herself and served it to her family, which sometimes included my younger self, without explaining what it was. I am not sure if she felt shame or enthusiasm about this. She often stammered something about the secret ingredient, but it quite obviously haunted her towards the very end of her life. What did I just read? You asked for this, OP, now you sit here and reap the fruits of your question. My grandma confessed to murder on her deathbed. Usually you'd think it was the pain relief, but she was such an eccentric it was actually believable. We traced all her ex-husbands, partners, and any other likely candidates, and fortunately no one was missing or died an untimely death, but sometimes I wonder. I didn't witness this personally, as it was between my grandfather and his father. My great-grandfather was not a nice man. He beat his children. One time he beat his daughter with a table leg, and I am assuming did the same to his wife. Anyway, she left him and the kids behind. This was the 30s, and I am assuming that he didn't allow her to take the kids with her, and it's not like women's rights were great back then. My grandfather left home at 8 years old and fended for himself for his entire life. On his deathbed, nasty grandpa told the boys that he had a bunch of money stashed on the old property, and if they went to see him, he would tell them where it was. No one went. Do you have a similar story? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.